Welcome to CNN News, everybody. Today, on History Update, we're going to do a documentary on the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong. And, in addition, we're going to show you a short clip edited by Professor Karan Ramchandani. The 1930s was a period of civil unrest in China, full of foreign invasions and rebellions. 6 years after the Manchukuo offensive, the Empire of Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. By 1938, 6 cities, Canton, Shanghai, Beijing, Nanjing, Chongqing, Xi'an, has fallen. After that, the Japanese have set their sights on the British-controlled city of Hong Kong. With almost all of southeastern China in Japanese hands, Hong Kong is effectively surrounded. Mortal is very slim in hope of successfully repelling a Japanese invasion.
By the afternoon of 25th December 1941, it was clear that further resistance would be futile, and British colonial officials headed by Governor of Hong Kong, Sir Mark Young, surrendered in person at the Japanese headquarters on the 3rd floor of the Peninsula Hong Kong Hotel. This was the first occasion on which a British Crown colony has surrendered to an invading force. The garrison held out for 17 days. This day is known in Hong Kong as Black Christmas.
Early in January 1942, former members of the Hong Kong police, including the Indians and Chinese, were recruited into a reformed police called the Kempei Tai with new uniforms. The police routinely performed executions at King's Park in Kowloon by using Chinese for beheading, shooting, and bayonet practice. The Japanese took over all police stations and organized the police in 5 divisions, namely East Hong Kong, West Hong Kong, Kowloon New Territories, and Water Police. The headquarters was situated in former Supreme Court building. Police in Hong Kong were under the organization and controlled the Japanese government. Japanese experts administrators were chiefly employed in the governor office and its various boroughs. 2 councils of Chinese and Eurasian leaders were set up to manage the Chinese population. Throughout the Japanese occupation, Hong Kong was ruled as a detained terrain and was subjected to martial law headed by General Ryusuke Isogai. The Japanese established their administration and commanding posts at the Peninsula Hotel Kowloon. The military enacted strict regulations and established executive boroughs to have power over all of residents of Hong Kong. On top of Governor Mark Young, 7,000 British soldiers and civilians were kept in prisoner of war camps or internment camps, such as Stanley Internment Camp. Famine, malnourishment, and sickness were common in these camps. Severe cases of malnutrition among inmates occurred in Sham Shui Po Internment Camp in 1945. Moreover, the Japanese military government blockaded Victoria Harbour to prevent foreign ships.
Economically, all trading activities were sternly guarded, and the majority of the factories were taken over by the Japanese. Having deprived the vendors of banks of their possessions, the Hong Kong dollar was outlawed and replaced by the Japanese military yen. The exchange rate was fixed at 2 Hong Kong dollars to 1 military yen in January 1942. Later, the yen was revalued at 4 Hong Kong dollars to a yen in July 1942, which meant local people could exchange fewer military notes than before. While the citizens of Hong Kong became poor in foreign and enforced exchanges, the Japanese government sold the Hong Kong dollar to help finance their wartime economy. Later, the yen was made the sole legal tender for official purposes. In June 1943, prices of commodities for sale had to be marked in yen. Hyperinflation then disrupted the economy, directly affecting Hong Kong citizens. Enormous devaluation of the Japanese military yen after the war made it almost worthless. With the intention of boosting the Japanese influence on Hong Kong, 2 Japanese banks, the Yokohama Specie Bank and the Bank of Taiwan, were reopened. Those 2 banks replaced the Hong Kong Bank and 2 other British banks responsible for issuing the banknotes. They then liquidated various Allied banks. British, American, and Dutch bankers were forced to live in a small hotel, while some bankers who were viewed as the enemy of the Japanese were executed. In May 1942, Japanese companies were encouraged to be set up. A Hong Kong trade syndicate consisting of Japanese farms were set up in October 1942 to manipulate overseas trade. The Japanese enforced a reputation policy throughout the period of occupation because of the scarcity of food and the possible counterattack of the Allies. As a result, the unemployed were deported to the mainland, and the population of Hong Kong dwindled from 1 to 6 million in 1941 to 600,000 in 1945. Furthermore, the Japanese reconstructed both government and private facilities for the sake of their own interests and developments.
Life was hard for people under Japanese rule. As there was an inadequate food supply, the Japanese rationed necessities such as rice, oil, flour, salt, and sugar. Each family was given a rationing license, and every person could only buy 6.4 taels of rice per day. Most people did not have enough food to eat, and many died of starvation. The rationing system was cancelled in 1944. An estimate was put forward by a Chinese physician who actively practiced in HK between 1941 and 1942. In addition, that in 1942, that at least 10,000 girls and women were raped in the month following the Japanese victory. During the occupation, hospitals available to the majority were very limited. The Kowloon Hospital and Queen Mary Hospital were occupied by the Japanese army. Despite the lack of medicines and funds, the Changhua and Guanghua Hospital continued their social services, but in a limited scale. These include the provision of food, medicine, clothing, and burial services. Although funds were provided, they still had great financial difficulties. Failure to collect rents and the high reparation costs forced them to promote fundraising activities like musical performances and dramas.
It was the Japanese conviction that educating was an imperative means in infusing the Japanese influence. Teaching of the Japanese language was obligatory, and students who received bad results in Japanese exam risked corporal punishment. English could not be taught, nor was it tolerated outside the classroom. Some private Japanese language schools were established to promote oral Japanese. The military administration ran the teachers' training course, and those teachers who failed at Japanese benchmark tests would need to take a 3-month training course. The Japanese authorities tried to introduce Japanese traditions and customs to Hong Kong students through the Japanese lessons at school. Famous historical stories such as Mori Motonari, Sanabon no Ya, and Sufu Voyage to Japan were introduced in Japanese language textbook. The primary aims of this Japanization of the education system were mainly to facilitate the Japanese control over the local people and to establish a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Therefore, what it was trying to create was a rush to learn Japanese. On the other hand, by 1943, only one formal language school, the Bo Gok School, had provided Cantonese language course to Japanese people in Hong Kong. According to the instructor of Bo Gok School, teaching Cantonese is difficult because there is no system and set pattern in Cantonese grammar, and you have to change the pronunciation and the occasion demands, and it would be easier for a Cantonese people to learn Japanese than a Japanese person to learn Cantonese. In January 1942, the HK Kowloon Brigade was established from the Guangdong People's Anti-Japanese Guerrilla Force. In February 1942, with local residents Gai Kuo Liang as commander and Chen Daming as political commissar, they were armed with 30 machine guns and several hundred rifles left by defeated British forces. They number about 400 between 1942 and 1945 and were operated in Sai Kung. Additionally, the guerrillas were noteworthy in rescuing prisoners of war, notably Sir Lindsay, Sir Douglas Clegg, Professor Gordon King, and David Bosanquet. In December 1943, the Guangdong Force reformed the East River guerrillas, absorbing the HK Kowloon Brigade into a larger unit. The British Army Aid Group was formed in 1942 at the suggestion of Colonel Lindsay Ryde. The group was rescued in Allied POWs, including airmen shot down and workers trapped in occupied HK. It also developed a role in intelligence gathering. In the process, the group provided protection to the Dongjiang River, which was a source for domestic water in Hong Kong. This was the first organization in which Britons, Chinese, and other nationalities served with no racial divide. Francis Lee Yu Pui and Paul Tsui Ka Cheng were commissioned as officers.
The Japanese occupation of Hong Kong ended in 1945. The United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on 6th of August 1945. Another one was dropped in Nagasaki 3 days later. At the same day, the USSR began the Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation, which crippled the last Grand Japanese Army in China. Japan finally surrendered on the 15th of August 1945. The British control over Hong Kong thus was restored. General Takashi Sakai, who led the invasion of Hong Kong and subsequently served as governor for some time, was tried as a war criminal and executed on the afternoon of 30th September 1946. Hong Kong's post-war recovery was astonishingly swift. By November 1945, the economy had recovered so well that government controls were lifted and free market restored. The population returned to around 1 million by early 1946 due to immigration from China. Colonial taboos also broke down in the post-war years as European colonial powers realized that they could not administer its colonies like it did before the war. Chinese people were no longer restricted from certain beaches or from owning assets on Victoria Peak.